Robert Harris has worked in the factory for 40 years. He always went to work at 5 in the morning, whether it was raining or not. He missed his birthday parties, anniversaries, and dinners with relatives. However, he never complained because he felt that his efforts would soon be rewarded. That day came when he turned 65 and retired. On the morning of his retirement, Robert sat at the kitchen table with a cup of black coffee in his hand. His wife, Sarah, sat across from him and watched him silently. She also waited for this day for a long time. Robert and Sarah dreamed of traveling to the mountains, which meant that they had to buy a cottage in the woods. They invested a lot of effort in preparing for their retirement and expected the pension funds to take care of the remaining part of their plan. Robert took a thick envelope from the table, which was given to him by the pension fund. He opened the envelope, and his hand started to tremble because of anxiety. Robert expected to see a check with a substantial amount of money. Instead, he saw the message that made his heart stop as he read it several times to make sure he was not making a mistake. The note said that the account was closed and the balance was 0. Robert gave the note to his wife and asked what was going on. She looked at the paper and gasped in horror while covering her mouth with her hands. How could this be possible? Robert and Sarah did not have any other savings for their retirement. He arrived at the bank the same morning and talked with the teller, who knew him well because he was a regular client for more than 30 years. However, the woman's face turned pale as Robert explained why he was there. The teller called the manager and showed him the documents. The bank manager asked Robert to follow him to the next room and gave him a detailed breakdown of his account. It turned out someone transferred the entire amount of his pension fund a week ago. Robert was surprised and asked to see the signature of the person who had authorized the transfer. The manager gave him a paper with the signature and told him the account was closed officially. Robert looked at the documents and realized whose signature was on the paper. It was his signature. He was not aware of any such transaction, and it was apparent someone stole his pension funds. Robert felt his heart beat as he figured out who was behind the crime. He drove to the factory, his former workplace, and tightened his grip on the steering wheel. His knuckles became white as the anger grew stronger inside him. However, the primary emotion that drove him was not rage, but devastation, because the person behind the pension fraud was Edward Brown, the factory owner. Edward sat in his corner office with his legs crossed over the desk and enjoyed a glass of expensive whiskey. Robert did not knock when entering the office, and Edward stopped talking immediately when he saw Robert. The factory owner looked at the paper Robert handed to him, and then at Robert's eyes. Edward seemed surprised and confused, but did not explain anything because there was nothing to explain. He got up, grabbed Robert's shoulder, and whispered in his ears that the pension fund mismanagement was a deliberate act, and Robert needed to get used to the situation. Robert turned around, gritting his teeth as Edward argued that no one would believe him, and that he represented a rich factory owner. These words resonated deep inside Robert's soul, as he realized Edward Brown had planned to steal Robert's life savings in advance. Robert was furious and ready to punch Edward in the face. However, he pulled himself together and asked the owner to explain what he meant. Edward told him not to waste his time and go away, because the court system was biased toward rich businessmen like him. Robert stormed out of the office, but his mind was clear, and he knew what he would do next. He realized that somewhere in his house, he had dozens of documents that could help him prove that Edward committed the fraud. Robert drove home and went to the dusty garage. He opened an old trunk and pulled out several packs of papers tied with rubber bands. He looked through the documents and smiled at the sight of familiar numbers and dates. Robert held one of the papers close to his chest and felt the pain of betrayal and anger in his chest. He also found the document that would bring his former boss to justice. Robert remembered what led to his retirement, and he knew what to do next. He called his friend Mr. Thompson the next day. The man used to be a lawyer, and Robert knew he would know what to do. Mr. Thompson listened to him patiently and carefully examined the documents Robert gave him. He also looked at the papers with the pension fund details and saw the slight differences in the signature. The bank transfer document had a forgery, but it was not perfect. Mr. Thompson said Robert had a strong case and promised he would help him prove that Edward Brown stole his life savings. They went to the courthouse a few days later. Mr. Thompson prepared the documents for the hearing, and Robert laid out his case. The court had to consider Robert's pay stubs and his pension fund plan, including the documents that proved Edward's guilt when they were transferred to his personal account. The handwriting expert testified that the signature on the bank documents was not Robert's. The judge ordered for the bank records to be produced, and it was revealed that Edward transferred the money on the day Robert retired. It was the day before the first pension payment was due. Edward's lawyers did everything they could to stop the hearing from moving forward. Furthermore, they tried to intimidate Robert and convince him that no one would believe him. However, Robert stood firm every time Edward Brown or his lawyers tried to bully him. He testified in court and told the judge the truth. The entire hearing made Robert realize that Edward Brown was a greedy and dishonest man who wanted to get rid of him so that the factory would belong to him when he was gone. The day Robert Harris's case was heard in court was a day he would never forget. He wore his only suit, and Sarah held his hand throughout the hearing. Edward sat across from them with his expensive lawyers. The judge told everyone to be quiet as Robert took a deep breath and looked at the man. Robert felt his heart pound in his chest because of the weight of the moment. He knew that what he was about to say would either save or destroy his life. Robert's documents were placed on the table in front of the judge and were examined closely. All of Robert's pay stubs were there, showing that he worked at the factory for 40 years. The pension fund plan was also there, and there was the paper with forged handwriting in the middle. The handwriting expert testified that the signature on the bank documents was not Robert's. Edward's face turned white as the judge examined each document carefully. The expert said the handwriting was significantly different from what was expected, and the judge ordered for the bank records to be produced. Edward's lawyers tried to argue that the documents provided by Robert were not enough evidence. They said he could have signed those papers himself. The judge ordered for the bank camera recordings from the day of the transfer to be produced. Mr. Thompson showed the court the recording Edward's assistant took when she transferred the money to his personal account. The woman admitted she stole the money because Ed told her to do so. Robert argued that the assistant was a pawn, and Edward Brown was the mastermind behind the entire operation. As a result, the judge ordered for the trust fund to be returned to Robert Harris. The court ruled that Edward Brown was guilty of forging documents and stealing from Robert Harris. The judge ordered for the trust fund to be returned to Robert and included the interest that Brown earned from the money. Edward Brown's assets were placed under court supervision. All of his property, including the factory, had to be sold to pay off his debts. The man lost everything because his greed overpowered his morality. Robert left the courthouse with tears of joy streaming down his cheeks. His wife gave him a big hug, and the reporters asked him to comment on the situation. Robert told them that honesty always wins in the end, and that everyone should be brave enough to protect their rights when the time comes. He said his words to millions of people across the country. Robert and Sarah eventually bought their dream cottage and spent their evenings watching the sunset in the woods. Edward Brown lost his wealth and freedom, but Robert never felt any sense of revenge in his heart.